Hello there. My name is Mark Ed. You just think of Ed with the mark right in the middle of it, and you got me pegged. I'm a storyteller. And I have been all my life. And the reason I'm a storyteller is because I got me a moose. Now, I know. She tells me she's not a moose, but she's a muse. But it's hard for me to say. It's a lot easier for me to just say moose. Now, I know a moose is an animal and the male's got big old horns on them, but that's not the kind of moose that I got. My moose is a beautiful woman, and she knows so many things, and she's told me so many things about, all sorts of things. And she tells me stories, and she's kept me entertained my whole life. And I just figured that I'd do the whole world a favor if I was to tell you some of the stories my moose has told me. Now, the first story I'm starting out with is an old fairy tale, and it was retold by the Grimm brothers. But the trouble is, in that story, there's all kinds of things that ain't right. So I decided that I'd start out to tell you the story the way it really was. The true story. Well, that is if mooses tell you true stories. Once upon a time, there was a sergeant, and his name was Sergeant Bearskin. And his first name, I think, was Antonio, but I'm not for sure. Sergeant Bearskin was a good soldier, and his king had him soldiering for a long time, for 30 years. And he had been in all kinds of battles, and he was tough, and he was brave, and he was tired of war. Well, finally the war was over. And old Sergeant Bearskin, he was ready for it to be over. The only trouble was, he didn't have nothing else he could do, because he was big for his age when he was young, and he had enlisted in the military when he was 13 years old. And the Leiden told him he was 18 years old. And they believed him not because he looked that old, but because they was desperate for people. Well, he worked his way up through the ranks, and he started out just doing what they told him, and kept on doing what they told him, but it was higher and higher up people that told him to tell people what they was supposed to do. And he became a very good leader. And he was promoted to the highest rank a sergeant there can be. But after 30 years of it, he said to himself, I've had enough. I don't have a family. I don't have nothing to go home to. And I want to make me a life. Now the trouble was, Sergeant Bearskin didn't have any kind of training except as a soldier. And the trouble was that his king was mighty mad at him leaving the military, and so he didn't give him one dime. Well, they didn't have dimes in those days. Whatever, well, they didn't give him one halfpenny. That means a half a penny. They didn't give him one halfpenny for any of the work he'd done for him, because he didn't want him to leave. And he thought after a little while he's just going to come back, because he's not going to be able to get him a job, because he can't do anything other than soldier. Well, Bearskin didn't want that, of course. He wanted a life, and he wanted a wife, and he wanted kids. And he was 43 years old. And he thought, I'm probably too old for all that, but I still want it. So he's quit. He'd been quit for about 2 weeks, and he was plumb out of food and everything. He was hungry, and so he sits down in this meadow, nice, clear, beautiful meadow with a stream running through it. And there was a stump there that someone had chopped down a tree. And I hate to admit it, but the reason they chopped down the tree was so there'd be a stump there to sit on in that pretty place. Now, the good news is they used the wood from the tree to make some boy a chest of drawers, and he was mighty happy for it. But that's another story. Well, anyway, old Bearskin sits down on this stump, and as he's a-thinking, and wondering, man, I wonder if I ought to go into the military again, because I ain't got nothing to do, I ain't got no money, and I don't want to starve to death, and that's what's going to happen to me unless I get a job. And as he's sitting there, now one thing I got to tell you, they did let him keep his rifle that he had used all through the years in the military, and like a military man, he kept the thing loaded. And he was careful with it. He was very careful with it. But still, well, anyway, he's sitting there on this stump, and all of a sudden, it seemed like just right next to the stream, he looked away for a second, and a second he looked back, there's a man standing there, and he's got a green cloak on. And he said, "Hello, Sergeant Belkin." And Sergeant Belkin had a good memory for faces, and he knowed he'd never seen this man before. And he says, "Who are you?" And he says, "Oh, don't pretend." And he holds out his foot, and he's got a cloven foot, a cloven hoof for a foot, like a goat. Well, in those days especially, nowadays not so much, but in those days everyone knowed that if you saw someone with a foot like a goat, you was looking at Old Scratch, the one called the Devil. Yeah, that's who it was. And he come to visit Sergeant Belkin, figuring out he could make a deal with him. Well, Belkin says, "All right, what do you want with me?" He says, "I ain't giving you my soul." And Old Scratch says, "Oh, I know that. But I would like to make a deal with you." And old Belkin, he thinks about, he's not that old, only 43. But old Belkin, he's thinking to himself, well, maybe I can outsmart him. I don't know. And Old Scratch says, "Here's the deal. First of all, I got to make sure you're brave, because I ain't going to deal with nobody that's not brave." He says, "Look over there." And old Belkin looks, and there's a great big old bear charging at him. Now, he had learned in the military to think quickly and to not lose his nerve. And so old Belkin puts his rifle up as fast as you can see, and he just shot that bear and hit him right between the eyes, and the bear went down. And the Devil, he say, "Well, okay, you're brave and you're quick. All right, I'll make a deal with you." Now, of course, he knowed all along that Sergeant Belkin was brave and quick, because he'd done some research on him, and he knowed his name was Belkin, and he was a brave soldier, and he was very lightning fast with his reflexes. But he had another reason for the bear getting shot. He says, "Here's the deal." He says, "I want you, first of all, to skin that there bear." Well, Belkin, he was happy enough to do that, because he's thinking, underneath that skin, he's got some good meat that I can get me a dinner. So he skins that bear, and he learned how to skin animals a long time ago, because when soldiers was away off in the field, there wasn't enough rations for them. They would hunt, and he learned how to skin all sorts of animals. He never shot a bear before. But anyway, he got it skinned, and he saw some places he could take some meat off. And the Devil says, "Okay, now that you got that bear skin all off, I'm going to make it so it ain't going to go hard on you. You don't need to tan it or nothing. I know you don't know how to do that." He says, "But I want you to wear this bear skin." He says, "Why do you want me to wear a bear skin? I've got this coat." And he says, "I want you to wear the bear skin. That's part of the deal. You won't do it? No deal." Well, Belkin says, "All right." And he says, "What's our deal?" He says, "Here's the deal. You wear that there bear skin, and it'll keep you warm. It's even got some extra space on it. You can make a hood for yourself so the rain won't get on you." He says, "But you got to wear it all the time. Never take it off. And you can't wash. You can't brush your teeth. You can't cut your beard or your hair for 7 years." And Belkin's thinking, 7 years? I'll be 51 years old. I might not live to be that old anyway. But then he's thinking, I don't want to go back to war. I'm tired of hurting people, killing people. He says, what happens if I can't do it? And the devil says, if you die during them 7 years, or if you take that bearskin off, or if you wash, or cut your hair or your beard, or brush your teeth, or do anything to get yourself clean, the deal is off and I get to keep you forever as one of mine. But if you live to the end of that 7 years and don't wash, and don't brush your teeth, and don't comb your hair, and don't cut your hair, and don't cut your beard, he said, then I'll make you rich for the rest of your life. And old Bearskin says, I know you're the father of lies. How do I know that you're telling me the truth? And the devil says, I make a promise, and I keep my promises. And now old Bearskin, he's worried a little bit because he knows that the devil's known for not being truthful. And so he says, I want you to swear on everything that's holy by the name of the man upstairs that this is true. Well, the devil, he didn't like having to take that oath. He didn't like that at all. But he did. And so Bearskin knew he was telling the truth. And the devil gives him a green vest that he had on underneath his cloak. And he said, put this on. So Bearskin put it on. All that outfit on him was kind of heavy. But the devil says, reach your hand into the right pocket of my vest. And he put his hand in the right pocket of the vest and pulls it out, and there's a handful of gold in his hand. And sure enough, he reaches his hand down in there and doesn't feel nothing, but when he pulls it out, there's a handful of gold. And the devil said, that'll work for you the whole time, so you'll never have to worry about stuff to eat if you can find people that are willing to sell stuff to you. And Bearskin says, okay, it's a deal. And so he starts to live. Now, the first thing he does, he doesn't want to let that bear go to waste, and so he cuts all the good meat off of it. And he fries it up. And while he's frying it up, there's people come up that's hungry, and they say, sir, we sure would like a bit of that meat you're having. And he says, well, help yourselves. And so they had a big old feast of bear meat, and that was the first good deed he'd done. But he done all kinds of other good things. Because that very day, as he's walking away, now he's still got his uniform on, and it's old, but it's still in pretty good shape. And so no one knows, and he's got this bearskin, and it's kind of weird looking, this fella with a soldier's uniform and a bearskin on the top of it, a green vest on his uniform too. But they could still tell he was a soldier. And he came across some people, and they was just in a rush to get their crops harvested. But the trouble was their horse had gone up lame, and they didn't have no way to pull that cart. Well, old Bearskin, he says, fill it up with everything you can, and I'll draw it into the barn, because one thing I am is I'm pretty strong. So they loaded the cart with their crops, and he just hustled that thing into the barn as quick as you can say. And they got their crop harvested just in time before the rain came. And he was tired, and he lay down, and he said, man, I can hardly wait to find me a good place to get a bath. That stream I was in this morning, that'd be just fine. And then he remembered, I can't do that. Well, things went on and on and on, and pretty soon everybody forgot that his name was Bearskin, and even he almost forgot. And they started calling him Bearskin. And old Bearskin went around doing good deeds. And people that needed money, he was pretty discerning. I mean, lots of people want money, but he saw people that was truly in need, people that was starving, or people that had a debt that was going to really hurt them if they couldn't pay it. And so many people was happy for him. Well, and at first, for the first couple of months, he looked all right. He started growing a beard, of course, and his hair got longer. And but he didn't look terrible. But after a while, he did start looking pretty wild because he couldn't even comb his hair. And so he did it up in a big old braid. And he didn't do that immediately. As after it got long enough and it was getting in his way, he did that. And he tied it off with a bit of twine down in the end. And as it got longer and longer and longer, he just rolled it up into a bundle and then tied the bundle with the twine. Well, he didn't look real good. In fact, he started looking bad. But worse than that, he started smelling bad. And that's one thing the original story doesn't talk about, but that's an important part of the story. Because someone can take someone that looks bad, but when someone smells bad, no one wants to be around you. And Sergeant Belkin, now called Bearskin, he was aware of that. And there was all kinds of nice people, and there were some pretty girls that he wanted to talk to and maybe even get something going with, but he started to be too embarrassed to be around them because he smelled so bad. But he kept on doing good deeds, and word of him came around, and they said, this guy smells terrible, but he'll help you out. And here's the funny thing. In his helping the people out, he learned a good bit about farming and a good bit about ranching. And he realized, well, I could be a farmhand or I could be a ranch hand. And he knew how to handle horses because he rode one when he was a soldier. And so he learned that people really wanted people that could handle horses, and he learned how to break them when he was 15. He learned how to break horses for the officers that was riding them. And so he went through the countryside, and he had learned some horse doctrine too, and some animal doctrine, and he did that too. But boy, when he got around people, they was standing pretty many feet away and made sure the wind wasn't blowing from him to them. They always got on the other side of the wind so they didn't have to smell his smell. And he was kind, and he was gentle, and he didn't act like a bad guy or anything, and he wasn't hard on people and never had been. And the people all loved him, they just didn't love his smell. Well, he had been in the business about 3 years, and he was mighty sick of it. But he didn't have no other choice. And when he'd go to an inn, because he liked to stay in inns, and he would say to the innkeeper, look, sir, I'll pay you double the price you ask me, because I can't clean up the room, and I'm going to leave a bad smell behind, because that's just the way I am. But I'll pay you double if you put me up. And as he got worse and worse, he paid triple even or quadruple, and it didn't matter because he always had the money in his pocket because of that green vest that the devil had given him. Well, anyway, he came to this inn, knocks on the door because it was late at night. Well, I mean, it was after dark anyway, and the door was closed because it was windy, but he knocks on the door, and the innkeeper opens it up, and his eyes is all red. And he says, oh, sir, I can't let you stay in this place. Now, Bearskin was impressed that he called him sir, even though he looked so bad and smelt so bad. And he said, I can pay triple the price of your regular stay. And the innkeeper says, all right, I'll give you a room. And he showed him his room, and it was a fairly nice room. But the innkeeper, as Bearskin looked at him, every time he looked at him, there were tears in this man's eyes. And Bearskin's saying, something's the matter here. And finally he says, look, sir, you are really sad, and maybe I can help you. And the man said, no, you can't help me. He says, give me a chance. And the innkeeper says, sir, I can't hardly breathe when you're as close to me as you are. And Bearskin says, then I'll sit on the other side of the room and you just raise up your voice. And the innkeeper says, all right, I tell you, I got 3 daughters, and they's all as beautiful as you can imagine, and I owe a debt. when I bought this inn, I thought my business was going to be better than it has been. And so I haven't been able to pay off the debt that I incurred when I bought it. Now the trouble is it's come due. And it's 5 times what it was when I got the money. And I don't have anywhere near that kind of money. And the man that I owe the money to has charged me that much because he's seen how beautiful my daughters are. And he wants to sell them to some rich guy for slavery. Well, Bearskin's eyes go wide and he says, man, I'd like to get a hold of that guy. And I'd show him a thing or two. But he says, the innkeeper, sir, don't worry. And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a handful of gold. And the innkeeper looks at it with astonishment and says, well, that's wonderful, but that don't nowhere near pay my debt. And he said, that's all right. And he reached into his pocket again, pulled out another handful of gold. Well, after he pulls out about 8 handfuls, the innkeeper says, that's enough. That'll pay my debt. And he says, yeah, but I got some more. So why don't we set you up a little bit? And the innkeeper said, I don't want to incur any more debt. It's just about ruining my life. And he says, this ain't no debt. This is a free gift from me to you. So he reaches in 3 more times and hands the innkeeper 3 more handfuls of gold. Well, he went into his room, and the innkeeper, he's awaiting for the man to come and collect his money, because he doesn't think the innkeeper's got the money. So he's going to take the daughters, and the innkeeper has his daughters all dressed in their beautiful dresses. And he's waiting there and for the man to come that's going to take them away, because the innkeeper's told him. And the man comes in, he's got this big old smirk on his face. He says, have you got the money? And the innkeeper says, well, I got this much. And he shows him 3 times the amount that he borrowed in the first place. The man said, ain't good enough. I'll give you a break and I'll let you go if it's only 4 times as much as you borrowed in the first place, but I ain't letting you go with any less. And he thought that was going to break the innkeeper. And he didn't know where he got the money he had, but the innkeeper says, you drive a hard bargain. He says, my daughters love me and I love my daughters. And I don't like the idea of losing them. And the man said, well, that's too bad, ain't it? You shouldn't have bought the money and borrowed the money in the first place. Well, the innkeeper says, all right. And he says, let me look through this cupboard one last time to see if there's a little extra money. And he says, it's got to be more than a little extra. But the innkeeper pulls up the whole amount, 4 times what he borrowed in the first place. And he had just been clever and gotten himself a little extra money because he didn't have to pay 5 times. And the man says, where'd you get that money? You stole it. And he says, no, I didn't steal it, but it's none of your business. Well, Bearskin's room is close enough and his window's open so he can hear all this. And the man goes away awful mad, but he still had 4 times what he loaned to the guy, and so he got some money out of it. He shouldn't be mad. Well, after a while, the innkeeper says, girls, a man gave me this money. He gave it to me. And the daughter says, well, you don't have to repay him? And he said, no, I don't have to repay him. And he's given us some good money to live on, that we can make improvements in the inn so we can get the business we was expecting in the first place. He says, but girls, this man is so kind and so good. I've heard stories of someone like this. I didn't believe him until he came into our inn. But he says, I want you, one of you, if you would, please, to promise to marry this man. And all 3 of the daughters says, okay, we'd be glad to. And the innkeeper says, well, there's something about him. This guy is kind of rough looking. Now, I wished he hadn't exaggerated that way, because Bearskin was more than kind of rough skin looking. He was the roughest looking person you could ever imagine. And scary too, but of course the stank. Well, so he calls to Bearskin, goes to his room and calls to him and says, come in and stand in the doorway. I'll have my girls stand on the other side of the room. And so Bearskin comes in, stands in the doorway, a little bit back from the doorway. And there was a wind that was blowing. It was blowing some of his stank away, but not much. Well, so Bearskin standing there, and the girls look at him, and the first girl, Effie, says, Daddy, you said it was a man. That ain't no man. That's just a big blob of stink. And she runs away laughing, thinking she's clever. Her name was Effie. The second daughter's name is Stephanie. And Stephanie takes a look at him and says, Dad, that ain't no man. That's a bear. I ain't going to marry no bear. And she goes away thinking she's so clever. But Isabella, she's the youngest, she looks at Bearskin and she said, Dad, this man deserves our thanks. And I'm going to give him the thanks that you asked. And she says, Sir, I promise to marry you. And Bearskin said, Ma'am, I can't ask that of you. You're a beautiful woman. There must have all kinds of suitors. And she said, well, I do. But my dad owes you so much, and I'm going to help him pay his debt. And Bearskin said, well, that's wonderful if you want to do that. But let me ask this of you. You wait until I've finished my 7 years. If I die, you're free. If I don't come back within 2 days after the 7 years is up, I ain't coming back because I'm dead. But if I'm alive and I come back to you, then you'll marry me? And she said, yes. He says, I promise I'll be all cleaned up. And she says, that's good. So he had him a ring about it. It was a ring that had belonged to his mama, she'd given it to him the day he went into the service. And when he'd gotten out, she was dead, so he kept the ring. Well, he took this gold ring and he broke it in half. Like I say, he was strong. And he gave half to Isabella and he kept half of it. And he went along. Well, I tell you what, the thought of that girl that had agreed to be his wife gave him strength. He didn't think he could have survived without what she had done. But he went through the countryside doing good, and he did good. But the man that wanted those 3 girls to sell him into slavery knew that he could have sold them for a lot of money. And he was mad. He felt like he'd been cheated. And he found out that Bearskin had given, or he asked Effie, actually. He asked her, and she says, oh yeah, a guy in a bearskin gave him a bunch of money. I don't know where he got it. Probably stole it. And the man said, well, I'm going to get my money out of him. And so he comes up to Bearskin, and the wind was blowing from his back right at Bearskin. So he couldn't smell much because the wind was blowing in the wrong way. And he took out his gun, he stuck it right in the middle of Bearskin's back, and he says, I want you to give me the rest of my money. In fact, I want that green vest you're wearing because they say that's where the money comes from. And Bearskin says, sir, I think it's a mistake for you to try and take this money. This money can only be used for good, and I can tell you're not. And the man said, well, that is none of your business, but I'm going to punish you for saying it. Give me the vest and maybe I'll let you live. And Bearskin says, look, you don't deserve this money and you don't want it. And the man says, I'll tell you what I want or don't want. Well, at that very moment, the wind shifted. And all of a sudden, this man that was trying to take his money is smelling bearskin, and he closes his eyes and sneezes because it's so bad. And Bearskin turns him around and he lifts both of his arms up so all that odor that was under there comes out. And this man, he faints away. And Bearskin took his gun away and he broke it over his knee. That's how strong he was. And when the man wakes up from being fainted, Bearskin's standing there over the top of him with his arms up, and he says, I don't want you coming near to me, and I don't want you coming near to them. If I hear about it, I'm going to stand over you like this for the rest of your life. But your life won't last long if you're having to smell fumes like I'm putting out. Well, sure enough, this man was pretty frightened, and he started having nightmares for the rest of his life of Bearskin standing over him with his arms up in the air. And so he left the family alone because he was mighty afraid of old Bearskin. Man, you can't blame him either. Well, the time went on and the time went on, and it finally came to the end of them 7 years. Now, Bearskin had been keeping meticulous, that means very careful notes of the day and the hour so that he could be ready when the time was up. So, the time had finally finished and he went back and sat on that there stump. And sure enough, old Scratch comes along and he says, all right, give me back my vest. You've proved you could do it. And Bearskin said, there's no way I'm giving you back this green vest because you gave an oath. And I have to have a way to be well off for the rest of my life. Now, the devil could not take the green vest back again because Bearskin was right. He'd been honorable. He'd kept his end of the bargain. And he says, well, fine then. And Bearskin said, oh, wait a minute here. You've got some things to do. You got to get me cleaned up, get my hair trimmed, get my beard cut. You've got to get my teeth taken care of. Well, devil says, you got the green vest, you can buy it all done. And he turns away and leaves in a rage. So Bearskin didn't know what to do because he was not looking good at all. Well, it so happens that the man upstairs had been watching out for Bearskin. And as soon as old Scratch leaves, another man comes by. And he recognizes Bearskin because he'd seen him 3 years earlier. And he says, Bearskin, how are you doing? And Bearskin recognized him, and his name is Frederick the Barber. He was a barber. And in those days, barbers did a lot of shaving of people and cutting their hair. And he says, Frederick, can you pay back some of the favor I did to you? And Frederick says, I sure can. I ain't got nothing to do right now. And Bearskin said, I need you to cut my hair and my beard. And Barber Fred says, well, I can do that, but they's so dirty. My scissors and my knives and razors aren't sharp enough to break through all that dirt. And so Bearskin said, well, there's a good creek right there and there's a good pool right there. And he says, well, that water's cold. And Bearskin said, you think I care? And he jumps in and he starts scrubbing himself off. And he scrubs and scrubs. He scrubs and he scrubs. And some of the dirt comes off, and Fred finally says, I forgot there, Bearskin, but I've got a bar of soap back in my backpack. And he comes over, pulls that bar of soap out. And so Bearskin starts washing with the soap. And there's more dirt comes out, more dirt than you can imagine. I mean, it turns out he was carrying 35 pounds of dirt just on his body and in his hair and in his beard. And so when he got up after washing it took him 2 hours in that cold stream, and the stream was so cold, he had to get out about every 5 minutes and warm up again till he could get back in there. It's a good thing there's no ladies around because he was naked, of course. And then after he got all washed, it took him, like I say, 2 hours. Then he went to and scrubbed his clothes off with that bar of soap. And by the time he was done, that bar of soap was that long that wide and that thick. I mean, he was worn down to the thickness of a piece of paper. And Fred said, "I just keep it, Bearskin." And they both laughed because they weren't worth nothing. Well, the barber went away feeling good because he repaid the debt that Bearskin had done for him, because Bearskin had helped him buy his barber shop that made him a good living. And after all the dirt and everything had washed away, Bearskin looks down in the river. Now he still ain't wearing nothing because there's no ladies around, and he was okay. But he looks down and he says, "Man, I don't think I've aged a day since I made that bargain with Old Scratch." In fact, he looks at himself and he says, "I look even younger. I look like I was 7 years younger than I was." And he says, "I wonder how that is." And he turns away and he said, "No, wait a minute here. I'm remembering as I was looking in that there mirror in the water that I was seeing a nice looking feller. I don't remember me being that nice looking of a feller." He looks in the water and sure enough, he is a nice looking feller. Now what had happened was that all those days of doing kindness, just like the dirt that was on him, all that kindness had shown itself up in his face. And kindness makes everything beautiful. And his face was just downright beautiful. And his body was downright beautiful. And he had washed his clothes. And he'd hung them up on the trees and just hoped no one comes along. But before there was dry, he heard some people coming. He heard some ladies' voices. Knew he had to get dressed back in his old ragged clothes because they was ragged. And he thought, "Oh man, I'm going to get rid of this bearskin." But he thought, "Well, you know, the thing is warm. And if I was clean," and so he got down in with the creek and he washed off the bearskin too. And now let me tell you this. There was 35 pounds of dirt on his body, but there was 35 pounds of dirt on his clothes and on the bearskin. And when he got all that cleared up, there was a flood of brown, nasty water going downstream from him a-washing. Well, the good news was that water washed onto a farmer's field, and that farmer's crop, his crops had gotten mighty poor because he'd used up all of his fertilizer, and he didn't have much anyway. He didn't have any cows or animals or nothing, so he could use their stuff for fertilizer. But when Bearskin's dirt washed onto that man's land, he got a crop like he had never had before. And he was growing tomatoes this size right here, the size of a small pumpkin. And he was growing peppers the size of a cantaloupe. And he was growing cantaloupes the size of a watermelon. And his watermelons were so big that nobody could even lift them except for him. Except for Bearskin. And Bearskin wasn't around. So the man sold his watermelons half at a time, and even then they couldn't hardly carry him. Well, he had such a good season that he was able to buy fertilizer for the next season, so he became prosperous. So Bearskin helped people even when he was just getting cleaned up. Well, finally he gets dressed and looks at himself, and he didn't look near as good with his clothes on because they were so ragged and everything, you know. But he went to a shop and then he said, "I'd like me some new suits of clothes." And they said, "Well, what can you afford?" Because they was looking at his ragged clothes, and he pulls out a handful of gold. "I can afford this much." Well, they got to work. It's funny how seeing someone has money makes some people motivated, you know. But they got to work, and pretty soon they had him up some pretty nice suits. And he asked them to make one in the military style, because a military dress uniform looks mighty fine on a man. And then he bought him a beautiful white horse and a chariot or a coach for him to ride in. And he drives that horse over to the innkeeper's place. Well, that innkeeper's place was much nicer than it had been when he'd been there. And he knocks on the door, And there's really no need to knock on the door of an inn because everybody's welcome. That's why it's called an inn. But it was late, and all the customers had gone home. In fact, it was 11 o'clock at the night, and the innkeeper and his three daughters was cleaning up the room. And old Belk, because I can't call him Bearskin anymore, he knocks on the door, and Effie, she answers, and she sees this tall, straight soldier looking at her, and he's about the best looking man she's ever seen. And she says, "What can I do for you, sir?" And he says, "I'm here to get married." And she said, "Oh!" And her face goes all red, and she's thinking, he must want to marry me because I'm the oldest. Of course, she doesn't recognize who he is. And she goes running off, and Stephanie comes to the door and says, "May I help you, sir?" And he says, "Yes, ma'am, I'm here to get married." And she says, "Well, he didn't want sister, maybe he wants me." And so she runs off to her room to get all prettied up. Well, Isabella's sitting in there, and the door was still open, so Bearskin just comes walking in. And she's sitting there, and her head's in her hands. And she takes a look up at him, and she puts her head back in her hands and starts crying. And he comes up to her and says, "What's the matter, Isabella?" Now, she didn't notice that he called her name because she was so sad. And she said, "Well, I would like to get married, but I don't think my husband's coming back. My husband-to-be's coming back. And then here comes a guy like you that's so handsome and beautiful, and, well, my husband-to-be, he's not as beautiful as you are." And old Belkin, he says, "Oh, ma'am, I'm sure he is." And as she's around her neck, she's wearing a chain, and sure enough, attached to that chain is half a ring he gave her. So he pours her a glass of water and drops his half of the ring in it. And when she gets down to the bottom, she's about to swallow it because she's thirsty, because she's lost so much water from all the tears she's been crying. And she sees this gold ring, and she fits her ring to it, or half a ring, and they fit just perfect. And she looks up and says, "It can't be." And he says, "It is." And she bursts into tears and throws her arms around him. Now, I got to admit, he was all cleaned up, and he knew that he was clean enough that he wasn't a stankin' anymore, but he wasn't sure about his breath. Well, back when he was Bearskin, and he'd been at it for 2 years, an angel comes walking through the territory dressed as an ordinary man because he wanted to test out what people was like. And he sees Bearskin there, and he knows about his situation. And he comes up to him and asks for some help. And his cart had got stuck in the mud, and Bearskin, with all his strength, had to use it to pull that man out, and he helped him for half a day. And at the end of the half a day, the angel said to him, "God bless you, sir." Well, that "God bless you" from an angel, that means a lot. And what had happened is, Bearskin hadn't brushed his teeth. Well, of course, when he got clean, he'd done everything in his power to get himself all cleaned up. But the amazing thing was, even though he hadn't brushed his teeth for 7 years, he didn't have one cavity. It was because that blessing the angel gave him. And it was also that blessing that helped him to be so strong through the whole 7. But anyway, that Isabella, she hugged him, and she saw this handsome man that was hugging her back, and she just couldn't help it. She gave him a kiss, and his breath was just fine. I just don't want you to worry about that. Well, she says, "I'm ready to get married right now." And he says, "So am I." And the father, he comes in and sees, "Isabella, you can't be hugging on another man. You's engaged." And she says, "Daddy, this is he." And her daddy says, "You're the Bearskin?" And he says, "Yes, sir, I'm the Bearskin, but not no more." And so, well, they called the preacher, and they called upstairs for the girls again and again, Effie and Stephanie, but they didn't come because they was busy putting on their makeup and getting their hair just right and finding exactly the right gown. Well, they missed the wedding. And when they comes back, they sees Bearskin and their younger sister kissing, and they was mighty unhappy with themselves, especially when they found out who she was kissing. Well, the story that the brothers Grimm told says they went out and killed themselves. Well, that ain't true. That's one of the things about the story that's always bothered me. They was good girls. And you can't expect even a good girl to want to marry a man that's a mess like he was. It's only because Isabella was special. Well, so they said they was sorry, and they was sorry, and they was jealous a bit. I can't lie about that. But they got over it, and they found them some pretty good fellers each to marry, and they was happy, but not as happy as Isabella. Because Isabella and Bearskin, they lived happily ever after. Now, here was the thing about that green vest. Bearskin didn't want to wear the vest all his life. I mean, he wasn't Bearskin anyway, he was Belkin, and he didn't want to wear that vest all his life because of where it had come from. But he hung it up on the wall, and it just hung there, and everybody, I mean, he had become famous because he'd walked all over the country in them 7 years and doing good everywhere. And he invited people to come to his house and put their hand in the pocket of that vest. If they was good people and wanted to do good with the money that they might find there, they pulled out a handful of gold. But if they wasn't good people, they pulled out a handful of something that smelled the same as Bearskin had smelled. So when they come out from reaching their hand in the pocket of that green vest, just by taking a whiff, Belkin and his Isabella could tell if they was good people, the kind of people they wanted as friends, or if they was bad people and people they didn't want to have nothing to do with. And so they not only lived happily ever after, but they had mighty good friends. And some of them friends went on and did some wonderful things. And in fact, some of the wonderful things those friends did will be the subject of a story I tell another time. But they lived happily ever after, and thank you for listening.